questions, a video / podcast / anything else it's going to be categorised as. Today I'm joined by Dr. George Bailey, who is going to help talk to us today about the history of Methodism, where it all came about, why we have Methodism, why we have this denomination, some of its foundations, and perhaps even speculate on a little bit of the future of Methodism. So George, thank you for talking to
It's a pleasure, thank you. It's very good to be here.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what your role here is at Cliff College?
Yep, certainly. So I'm a lecturer at Cliff College. I'm a Methodist minister. So my role at Cliff is half-time. And my job title is that I'm the lecturer in mission and Wesleyan studies. What that means is I do any of the teaching and sessions around Wesleyan things, Methodist Church things. But I also teach things about mission now. I teach quite a bit of theology and church history beyond Methodism as well. So that's kind of what I do here, and on all different levels, of course. The other half of my ministry is in Leeds, where I'm a Methodist minister with 2 churches.
Wow. And you're quite because I remember at festival you were doing the talks on Samuel Chadwick as well, weren't you? A very famous Methodist.
This year I did some research into Samuel Chadwick, who was principal of the college at one time, and previous to that had a significant ministry in the city centre of Leeds.
Oh, that's a great link, really.
Yeah, he's close to my heart because he commuted between Leeds and Cliff for a few years as well.
The second Samuel Chadwick could be right here in front of us.
Not sure about that, but yeah. Yeah,
so
not transformed Leeds yet.
So perhaps for those who are listening and thinking, actually, I know very little about denominations or very little about the differences between churches, in a very difficult question, what is Methodism?
Right. I shall do my best to keep that brief. So it's a Protestant church, so it's in the tradition of the Reformation that came out of the split with the Catholic Church in the 16th century, and specifically it comes out of the Church of England. So it's an English church, its roots in England, from the Church of England in the 18th century. So just under 300 years ago. And originally it was a revival movement within the Church of England. In the 18th century there was a significant revival of interest in Christian faith, in church life, which the Methodist societies then were at the heart of. That's where it comes from. So
it birthed out really as a kind of revival within the Church of England, and that's where we get Methodism today.
That's right, yeah. So the revival was focused around a number of key people. Very significant within those was the Wesley brothers, John and Charles Wesley. So they, along with other friends, were students and also teachers, fellows at Oxford University, and for a number of different reasons decided to take their Christian faith much more seriously. So in 1729 decided to get together as a group of friends and to meet regularly, several times a week, to pray, to read the Bible, to go to services, and then as things developed also to take seriously what they read there about how their lives should be. So doing things which were a kindness to others, visiting those who weren't well, visiting those who were in prison. This all became part of their life, and they were very disciplined about it. So in the 1730s they stood out amongst the other students at Oxford University at the time, and they got called various nicknames, like they got called the Holy Club, and they also got called Methodists for being methodical about what they were doing. But it was a negative term, it was a term of abuse, but they kind of took the name on and said, yeah, we'll keep that, we quite like that name. So that's where the Methodists come from. It's right back there in the 1730s in Oxford.
Wow. So if we look at that idea, because of course Charles and John Wesley being predominantly the founders of the Methodist movement, hearing that kind of description of what they were doing at Oxford, surely that's quite similar to what people in Church of England were doing. I mean, if you hear that description, a lot of people go, well, wouldn't that be what Christians were doing anyway? Why were John Wesley and Charles Wesley so unique? Why was this club so different?
Yeah, there were other people in England doing similar things, but the majority of people that they were mixing with and within in Oxford and elsewhere around the country were not taking faith so seriously. You remember then that nearly everybody was in the Church of England. It still is the established church, but then it was the established church, and it was very dominant and written into the laws of the country. There wasn't really much other option, and people belonged just by where they lived. Everybody was part of the Church of England by default. unless they opted out. And that was a risky and serious thing to do, because it would put you on the wrong side of the law, or at very least it would mean that you would be discriminated against by the law. So it was Church of England. And when that's the situation, it's easy, and this happens across all of church history, it's easy when the church is so closely tied to society and to the state, for people not to need to take Christian faith as seriously as they might do, not to really engage with it personally. So the Wesleys and their friends were interested in a much more personal relationship with God, and a much more personal response to what they found in the Bible and in the tradition of the church.
So perhaps at a time when it was become almost tradition and second nature to go to church, they were trying to push people back to the heart of it.
Yeah, that's right. And their initial sort of quest and idea was for holiness. That's always been at the very heart and root of the Methodist movement that came from it, was this striving for, desire for receiving God's holiness and trying to find out what that meant in our lives. And this is a theme that runs throughout the scripture. God says to his people, I am holy, therefore you also shall be holy. That's Leviticus, and it's echoed in the New Testament, in the letters of Peter, and throughout the New Testament. And Jesus even says to his disciples in the Sermon on the Mount, be perfect as my Father in heaven is perfect. So it's a really strong call to this full life, complete devotion to God and to what God's calling us to, the service of others. So that was at the heart of it, holiness, really. And I say, originally, some people, when they were taking the mickey out of them, said, you're the holy club, because that's all you're interested in. So that was the heart, holiness. Yeah.
So what was it that perhaps made them such a target for perhaps criticism, do you think?
Well, initially it was that desire to be so dedicated, which in any situation that inevitably makes other people feel uncomfortable. But then things changed and went on a level as well, because the Wesleys and George Whitefield and others of their companions were sort of, for 10 years, constantly reading and searching the Bible, and reading and searching through the history of the church and the writings of the church to try and work out how this personal relationship might function, how it might work for them. And what happened was that they read in different bits of the Christian tradition, and they met people, particularly some German Christians. They were called Moravians, and they're very much in the sort of the tradition of Martin Luther, and a more recent then tradition from the 17th century in Germany called Pietism. Piety means devotion, or being serious about your prayer and your worship. So they were pietists in the sense that they had this sense of what they called heart religion, following Jesus Christ that touches your heart and transforms your heart, not just going to church because that's what you have to do, but going because you really want to and you feel a devotion to God. So the Wesleys and Whitefield were influenced by this and began to read their Bibles in a new way. They began to read it much more personally. So when it talks about people being saved through the grace of God alone, and that simply by having faith in it, they began to understand, with the help of these Moravian German Christians, that meant that they should really feel and sense God changing them and forgiving them and acknowledging them. So John Wesley in particular, we have the most complete records of his journey, because he wrote lots of letters and diaries and journals, which he also published. So we have a sort of record of his spiritual development. And he became more and more worried in the late 1730s, so 1737, 1738, that he didn't really have this for himself. So he was already at that point an ordained priest of the Church of England and a fellow teaching theology at Oxford University. He'd been sort of 10 or 15 years down that journey of his career, yet here you come to a crisis. Well, I don't actually have this assurance that through Jesus Christ, God has forgiven me and loves me.
So if I'm right in thinking that experience was when he was on his way over to America, and he was on the boat with the Moravians, and it started to seem as if they were going to sink and they were all going to die. And if I'm right, John Wesley had a bit of a crisis of a moment, thinking a lot of great fear, as I suppose many of us would, of what's going to happen next, what happens if I die. sheer fear that crippled him, and yet the ravens below were just singing praises.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, he was he sort of observed himself almost and said, "Well, why am I so afraid? You know, why if I believed what it is promised in the Bible about the way God feels about me, if I trust in Jesus, then I shouldn't be afraid." So that really set him thinking on this for then the next 2 or 3 years and searching. It all came to a change ahead, we think, in 1738. So Methodists often hold the date of the 24th of May 1738 as a special date because it's the date that John Wesley experienced this assuring love of God himself in a new way. Now, in fact, his brother Charles had already experienced it a few days earlier, and their friend George Whitfield 2 or 3 years earlier. So he was one of several experiencing this at the same time.
Was this the experience of the famous phrase, heart strangely warmed?
That's right, yeah. He wrote in his diary and then published it in his journal explaining what happened that day, saying my heart was strangely warmed. So it's difficult really to understand what happened. He gives a description of it, but we don't really quite know exactly what it was, and different Christians have interpreted it differently since then. But we know it was significant change, really because of the way before that Wesley was kind of searching and struggling. His ministry wasn't really going anywhere. He'd had an unsuccessful trip to Georgia where he really struggled to implement some of his ideas. He'd come back, he tried to found a society. That was going okay, but he was preaching and he didn't feel that anything was really going right with his preaching. So thereafter, after he'd had this experience, things change radically and a revival begins. So we know that. We don't really know quite how and why. And Wesley he writes in his journal, but he doesn't say much about it otherwise in his life. It's not really part of his testimony, interestingly. But this moment is 24th of May, 1738. He says that he went to a meeting, a place in London, Aldersgate Street, just like a meeting room where some Christians had gathered together, and for that evening somebody was reading from Martin Luther's writings about the book of Romans, where we don't know exactly which bit, but we know in the book of Romans is where Paul writes about God saving us through Jesus Christ, through the grace of Christ, and because Christ died for us, we are made right with God. So we guess, some people guess maybe that's the sort of thing that he was hearing. We're not sure. But while he was hearing read, he said, my heart was strangely warmed. And he writes about the experience of the day or two after, that he felt a new freedom from sin. So he'd been struggling with temptation. He felt a freedom from that. A new power for serving God. Although then very quickly in his journal writes that, however, he soon found himself struggling again. So from that moment he goes forward, and the revival, which has already been happening a bit, begins to happen, and he begins to join in with it. So then significant things go on from there, which is really where the Methodist societies come from.
So the big push of Methodism in many respects came after this experience.
Oh yeah,
which is why it's such a pivotal point.
Yeah,
presumably.
So the story I told from the beginning about the Holy Club in Oxford, Wesley sees a clear line of trajectory, a clear development going forwards, but there is this moment. Another key moment is that he went with his friend George Whitfield, who I said 2 or 3 years earlier had already experienced something similar to this. George Whitfield at that time, in early 1739, had been working and ministering in Bristol, and he had found, the same as Wesley found, that when they were preaching this doctrine, they weren't being invited to preach in Church of England churches. The ministers there didn't like the way they were preaching, because in some way there was an implied criticism that they'd never told their people about this.
Right.
This was a really exciting new way of interpreting and seeing the Bible and Christian faith, and here they were, they'd not been telling anybody. So that was kind of implied in Wesleyan and Whitfield's message. So they weren't really welcome to preach in the churches. So Whitfield had decided that he would try preaching outside. Now that seems fairly reasonable, but at the time that was really controversial because of the laws that controlled Christian faith and kept it in the Church of England. So Church of England parish churches were the place legally where you could do preaching and interpreting scripture, and if you did it outside of that, then you would come under the laws for people who were outside the Church of England. So it's quite very controversial for them to do it. And also the fact that people that might have the power to decide whether you could or couldn't preach in the town square or in a field outside the village were the vicars. Now, of course, these were both priests, but they weren't vicar of those parishes they were preaching in. They just arrived from London. So you can imagine the local people being quite upset. As it was, George Whitefield had started preaching outside, and he invited Wesley to join him. They were gathering huge crowds, thousands and thousands of people. Some of the quotes are immense, and nobody's ever quite sure that they're true, but sort of crowds of up to 20 or 30,000 people. Remember, this is in the days before PA systems. So huge, and not that many people living in the locality. People will have travelled because they've heard this person was going to preach and it was exciting. Come, travel, gather, squeeze together to hear. And people then were experiencing God in a new way, similar to the way Wesley had. You know, they were finding themselves changed. They were finding their lives different because after this preaching and often singing of hymns as well, God met with them and transformed them. They responded to the message.
No, it's listed in church history as the first great revival of this country.
Yeah.
It came about in this kind of Methodist movement that was pushed in.
Yeah, it was significant.
So if you're looking at so the Church of England Church clearly took a bit of a negative look on this, as far as almost stealing a bit of thunder by the sounds of it, and you know this pristine traditional way that things have been set in plan. With the Wesleys and Whitefield really just crushed all that and said, look, we're going out to the people. Yeah. We're going to do this. It was a very missional kind of movement.
Oh, definitely.
At that point.
Yeah, and they saw themselves, certainly Wesley particularly, John Wesley, and Charles Wesley even more so perhaps, saw themselves as they were both priests of the Church of England. Their passion was to reform the Church of England, to revive the Church of England. And that they argued passionately that there was nothing they were preaching or teaching that was different from the Church's doctrine. And the Church of England lays out its doctrine in the Book of Common Prayer, in the Articles of Religion, and the Homilies of Religion, which are still there at the heart of Church of England doctrine. And the Wesley said, well, all we're doing is telling people what it says there, and interpret Scripture in the same way. So they really wanted to see a revival within the Church and within the nation. The Church and nation, of course, very closely tied together. And the way it worked out was that Whitefield had specifically asked John Wesley to come and help because he knew John Wesley had already been working with little groups, like he did right from the days in Oxford when he gathered together that little group of people. He did the same when he went to Georgia, and he'd done the same in London as well before he had his heart strangely warmed. He was gathering what he called societies, people to meet together to encourage one another in their faith. So Whitefield said, look, here are people responding, can you do that here in Bristol? And that's where it began. He, straight away as Wesley preached, he reports in his journal, some people came after the service, after the preaching event, as it was, and said, what do we do now? We think we've met Jesus in a new way, what should we do? And he said, well, commit together to meet once a week, to read the Bible, to pray, and to talk about this, and see what happens. And that was the pattern, really. So societies were set up all over the country. The preachers and the leaders of this movement travelled a lot to different cities and towns, and wherever they went, societies were formed by the local people, and they quickly had a structure whereby they met as a society weekly. They had small group meetings within that. They called them classes, which sprung up by accident because they had debts because they built buildings to meet in, and they'd taken out loans, so they had to keep these debt payments up. And a good way to do that was get everybody to say, we'll give a penny or whatever a week, and put someone in charge of collecting it from a dozen people. And then within a few months of that, they realised that actually this was really powerful for helping people in their faith, because you'd go and see everybody each week. So they'd get together as a group, pay their money, but then stay for an hour or two and talk about the work of God in their lives. And that's at the heart of the Methodist movement, these societies that help people grow.
So it is very outward-facing, almost, in that respect. It's very different to the Church of England at this time.
Yeah, it's different because, outward-facing, yes, but also because you could be a member of the society. So you joined and you became a member, and once you became a member, there was rules, there was discipline. You had to turn up to the meetings, and if you didn't turn up, they would kick you out. They'd take away your membership ticket.
Yeah, I mean, this is we've been reading about Method. It was John Wesley seems almost very blunt, very very down. I mean, if I remember correctly, if someone wouldn't fast on a Wednesday and a Friday, then you were not going to be sent out by John Wesley. You needed to see that level of dedication.
Yeah. They were strict with themselves, I suppose. So there was that sort of very intense, you might say, inward-looking kind of community that was intense. But yes, it was outward-looking because the whole focus was on serving God and serving God by serving others. So again, right, continuous from the very early days when they were students in Oxford. These Methodist societies had a real intense life together, growing in faith together, but also an intense life of serving the neighbourhood. So they became little focuses for setting up help for the neighbourhood, like medical services, such as they were at the time. And John Wesley was very interested in the new scientific discoveries in medicine, which we would consider completely strange, but they were cutting edge, and he paid, the society put their money together and paid to offer what they could to the poor people. They gave out clothes and food. They had a sort of education going on in these societies, so for children, but also for adults. The movement published huge amounts of material. A lot of it simply to be able to give people literature that they could afford, books they could afford to buy, so they could learn to read and then learn more and more about science of the time, but also the Christian faith.
Well, it seems Methodism became very much a kind of movement for the working class of its time. Of course, with Charles Wesley writing a lot of the hymns so that people could learn bits of theology and bits of scripture through song, who perhaps couldn't, get to the Bible and this, and as you say, releasing, publishing books and so that they could read these things that they could afford. It became very much a difference of class almost between Methodism and Church of England.
To an extent, yes, yeah, and of course this coincided with the early Industrial Revolution, so things were changing rapidly in a lot of areas, towns and cities of Britain were growing rapidly. The Church of England, that divided everywhere up into parishes, and each parish having a minister, didn't respond very quickly to the changes. So there's quite a lot of examples around the country where there was a parish with a minister that previously had a few farming villages that suddenly had a new mining industry strike up, or woolen industry, or all sorts of different things, which would then gather these great new populations of people. And there weren't the ministers, there weren't the church buildings to support them. So that was often the sort of place that these Methodist societies took root, because local people responded to the fact that somebody had travelled a long way to come and preach to them and to care for them, and that they'd make a society in response. So it did become like that. Yeah.
So presumably that's where the Methodist churches come from, or at least a lot of the older ones. These societies that starting out very naturally, getting a loan, getting a building, and then that you get all of a sudden these buildings of Methodism sprout up all over the place. Yeah, which is really why we have so many in the country.
Yes, it became really a nationwide phenomenon. There was never a huge number of Methodists compared to the population, but I think their impact, because of their dedication and their commitment together to be working for God, their impact was bigger than their sort of proportion of the local population. So it became very significant. Now, originally, of course, there were societies, and they were all part of the Church of England. And for a long time, decades and decades, they were really careful, for instance, not to make any of their meetings clash with the services of the Church of England. And the encouragement written into their rules was that everybody would go to worship at the Church of England. So, particularly for the communion or Eucharist, whatever your tradition calls it, there's different ways of calling it, bread and wine, as Jesus told us to use. That would always be at the parish church, and the Methodist society people were encouraged and meant to go there. And it could be a matter of discipline if they didn't. So your sort of regular pattern of worship was still Church of England, and then they'd meet as well in their society once a week and in their class once a week, and then often they had other small group meetings to sort of mutual accountability and fellowship called bands. So there's some serious commitment to church life going on. Over time, the Church of England that they were hoping to reform and the Methodist societies grew apart for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, I was about to do my next question, because it seems that with such a heart to reform the Church of England, such a heart to not take away from the Church of England, it seems almost strange then to think we have this Methodist denomination completely apart from it.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine that just in lots of local situations there might be tension and strain with what was going on. If there was a society that had got its own building and had its own structure of meetings for worship and prayer and Bible study, and that might conflict, even if they tried carefully not to clash the times, just people's commitment and energy would be conflicting between the Church of England parish and the Methodist Society. So it's not surprising really that they grew apart on a larger scale as well. Things really came to a head because the Church of England weren't cooperating with what the Methodist societies saw themselves needing by way of ministry. So this in theory shouldn't be an issue in this country because there was always a parish church, although it became an issue when the parish church wasn't near to where the Methodist Society building was. People would have to travel to go to the parish church. What did that mean? The Church of England was slow to respond to that situation, but then more so to do with North America. This country had established colonies in North America, so there was a flow of people backwards and forwards. And the Methodists, understandably, wanted to send their preachers, or commission preachers from there, to be helping people there, just as they were here. And that was seen as normal and sensible thing to do. But they saw there were lots of communities in North America that didn't have a Church of England priest. And if they didn't have a Church of England priest, they couldn't have communion, Church of England communion, or any sort of church life. So the Methodist societies here asked the Church of England if they would do something about that and said, look, we've got people going that we're ready to send, that are preachers, that are experienced, that are trained. Would you make them priests so that they can also deliver the sacraments of communion and baptism? But the Church of England bishops wouldn't do it. And they were reluctant to do it because it was outside of their normal way of doing things. So in the end, after quite some years of debate and controversy, John Wesley, who was the leader of the Methodist societies, the president of the conference of preachers, he ordained some of the preachers himself. Now, this was contrary to Church of England understanding because he wasn't a bishop, so he shouldn't have done that. He had his own arguments about why it was okay. They had their own arguments about why it wasn't. But really, that was 1784. From that point on, the drift apart became more and more clear. John Wesley died in 1790. When he died, he worked at trying to put in place the legal structures that would mean his societies carried on. And very quickly, within a few years of his death, they became much more like a church. So they began to have their own communion services in the life of their societies, and some had already done it quietly anyway. And not just to rely on people who'd been ordained by the Church of England, but to have their own way of ordaining people to do that within the Methodist societies. And the Methodist societies then became the Methodist Church.
So you think it was still perhaps, we can only speculate I suppose, but do you think it was still John Wesley's plan and vision even up until his death that it wouldn't take away from the Church of England? Yeah,
what John Wesley did or didn't think is a matter of debate.
Yeah.
People get very worked up about that. The historians get very interested in everything he wrote and said and did. I think, that was, I suspect that was still his desire and wish. He was always a priest of the Church of England and really didn't want to depart from that. And it carried on in the Wesleyan Church. It was called the Wesleyan Methodist Church, the one that sort of came about from this Methodist Society route. It was a long debate in that church going right into the 19th century, really? How they should or should not be related to the Church of England.
Still a debate that goes on today to a degree, isn't it?
It is, largely, yes, yeah. All through the 19th century, what had been one Methodist church split in all sorts of different ways across the country and nationally, and there were lots of Methodist churches as a result. They had arguments about various things: the relationship with the Church of England, the role of lay people compared to those who were ordained, the use of organs in music. So in the 1840s, a number split in protest at the building of organs in Methodist churches and chapels, because they saw that as being distracting from the true worship of God.
Oh wow!
Which is, people don't realise that now. Organs were the new modern thing that everybody resisted, and all sorts of other things. So by the end of the 9th century, beginning of the 20th century, there were numerous Methodist churches. A number of them had sprung up because of new revivals. Like the Primitive Methodist Church was a new revival in the early 19th century that was Methodist shaped, but it began a new church. And
what was the Primitive Methodist kind of movement? What was the difference between that?
Well, it was very similar to the Methodist societies of the 18th century. They'd become the Wesleyan Methodist Church. but the primitives there was still plenty of places and peoples where there were no chapels, or there were new populations because of the Industrial Revolution, and they sprung up as a number of revivals happened across particularly the Midlands of the country, and they just founded a new church. It didn't seem to them right to join the Wesleyan Methodists, even though they had a Wesleyan kind of understanding of faith. They started their own. They saw themselves as being truer to the origins and the heart of the movement as the Wesleyans had
going more back to the foundations.
As it were. So they would say they weren't called Wesleyans, but they would probably argue they were more Wesleyan than the Wesleyan Methodist Church, in line with what Wesley had intended for the movement.
When talking about John Wesley, I know we spoke about this a little bit before I started recording. The Calvinist Arminian debate, predestination, free will. I know you've listened to the chat I did with Aaron, who is a Calvinist, or for the sake of the argument, listed himself as a Calvinist. And if you've not heard that one, I do urge you to go and listen to it. But I'll give you a little bit of a chance to respond. Given Aaron's argument of predestination and Calvinism, because speaking of Whitefield and John Wesley, those two famously fell out over this very debate. Whitefield being a Calvinist and John Wesley being a very devout Arminian. In fact, even preaching on why you shouldn't be a Calvinist. He felt very strongly about it. And even in the Methodist Church today, there are those who still hold quite a strong stance on how we must be Arminian and not Calvinist.
Yeah. So I would say a couple of things to that. I have an ongoing debate with my colleague Aaron.
I realise I've not given you as much time as he had.
That's fine. Won't take long. Wesley was Arminian. We don't think probably he ever actually read any Jacob Arminius. So he was Arminian very much in an 18th century sense. So if anybody's interested in the history of theology, it's sometimes a mistake to confuse what was going on in the early 17th century with what was going on in the 18th century. But broadly, he was in line with that understanding, as were, I think, probably the majority of the Church of England at the time. So Wesley was in line with that because that's what he'd been brought up to think and believe. And loosely, that position is focusing on the love of God instead of the sovereignty and the power of God. So that because God is loving, God, it's not quite the right way of putting it theologically, but roughly speaking, God limits his power in order to allow people to have freedom of choice, free will, and God wants people to respond to his love with a yes. But it means that it leaves open the possibility that people might respond with a no. Now, in a Calvinist understanding as it was expressed in the 18th century, that leads you into a theology whereby some people are predestined to say no because God has made them like that, because that's a sort of logic that goes if God is all powerful. Whereas in the Arminian logic, the primary thing is that God is all loving. So within Methodism, this become expressed as a little catchphrase, which is actually from 1903, so it's not what Wesley said, which is a mistake a lot of Methodists think. Wesley said this, he didn't, but it sums up what Wesley thought, which is that all need to be saved. Well, that's very much in line with Calvinist doctrine anyway, all need to be saved. But diverging then differently, all can be saved. So it's possible that all people could be saved, all could respond with a yes to God. Then there's two more alls, there's four alls. All need to be saved, all can be saved. All can know that they are saved. So some people sometimes make an argument, oh well, people don't, but even if they don't know that they're saved, they can be, and there's a sort of behind the scenes theology goes on that people can be saved whether they know about it or not. Wesley says all can know that they're saved, even if you prescribe to that sort of theology that says it doesn't matter what people think themselves, all can know it and think they are. And fourthly, all can be saved to the uttermost, completely, fully. Now actually, for Wesley, that fourth one was probably the most important one, which is the bit of his theology that's most been neglected in Methodist Church going forward. But for Wesley, he made it clear that was the most important. So he felt that people could be fully transformed by God, fully live out God's holiness in their lives, sort of fully become the people that God desires them and intends them to be. Fully know God's love. Now he often expressed it with a really unfortunate word, which caused him huge problems and still causes problems trying to talk about it. So he described it. It's worth me saying it because you might pick up a book by Wesley. It's probably the most likely book you might find somewhere by Wesley about Christian perfection.
Yes.
So it's a really unhelpful term.
Yeah, I actually had someone talk to me recently about how that they disagreed with it purely on the basis of what it was called, this Christian perfection that he came across.
Yeah, it's not helpful at all. And it does come out of the Bible. And most English translations of the Bible, the New Testament, still have that word in a number of different places. So it's just purely scriptural. And Wesley would have said, well, there's a lot of problems with this word, but he defended using it because it's in the Bible. Christian perfection. But what he means is a fullness of God's love. In a Calvinist, Reformed, that's just sort of synonymous terms in church history, in their understanding of holiness, of the way that God transforms people, there's a limit on that in this life. So in that tradition, you're sort of classically always a sinner. You always need to be forgiven as if it was day one. Now within the Calvinist tradition, you can actually, there is some sense of progress a little bit. But in a Wesleyan tradition, Wesley said, no, if God writes in the Bible that you can be holy, you should be holy, you should be full of God's love, then it's possible.
And his backing of perfection was more not that you are a perfect being all of a sudden, but rather you fully appreciate God's love to such a perfect degree that although you still sin and still carry on that, it almost like the love of God washes over that still.
Yes, yeah. Now, quite what he thought about sin is very difficult to pin
down.
Yes. But he did seem to be saying that there was a sense in which you can be freed from the desire to deliberately do things which are wrong and hurtful to others. It doesn't mean that you don't sin, because you're still human and you still make mistakes, there's still things you don't know about. So every day you go about, even if you're fully filled with God's love, you still go about getting things wrong, but you don't mean to. You don't do it deliberately, you don't do it maliciously. I think that's the level at which he was talking about being free from sin. It's almost as if you're still tempted, but you're enabled and empowered by God's Spirit not to give in to that temptation to do things in a mean way. So it's a sort of limited view of what it was, but it was significant. And in Wesley's lifetime, particularly in the 1760s, 1770s, and up to his death, there were lots of people in the Methodist societies who wrote really moving testimonies about being filled with God's love in this way. You know, they'd often been followers of Jesus for 15 or 20 years or more, but then suddenly they'd been longing for this, and they had this wonderful experience which meant they were just filled with joy. Never that they'd sort of finished their job or finished needing Jesus. In fact, the other way around, it was like they were filled with God's love and God's joy and just so aware of how that they relied on Jesus every day, and they needed God's love and forgiveness, and because they could accept it fully, they could now be fully loving to others. So it's a really moving and powerful thing, but yeah, very controversial in the Christian tradition.
And this is ultimately what kind of led to his odds with Whitfield.
Yeah, that was at the heart of it, and particularly later on, when Wesley was using the term Arminian, particularly in the 1770s, 1780s, towards the last third of his life, it was primarily to defend this experience of the fullness of God's amazing love. And he published something called the Arminian magazine, and its primary thing it's full of is these testimonies, which are really remarkable to read, of people experiencing God's love in a full way. Yeah.
Wow.
So that it's surprising sometimes to people that was at the heart of Methodist spirituality. It's not quite so much talked about at all now in many Methodist churches.
No, not at all. No, definitely. So if we look at kind of some of the things that have carried on throughout Methodism, and perhaps some of the things that have been dropped, trying to think of some of the core beliefs. One of the first things I want to talk about is, Methodism was a dry faith for a very long time, almost proudly so. We're a dry faith, we don't drink, and actually as part of that discipline of membership, you would have to be dry as well. And yet Methodism has strayed away from that currently. Yeah,
it was interesting, that one. So it was really in the mid-late 19th century that became a key part of Methodist practice. Before that, there had been so in the 18th century there was often writings against excessive abuse of alcohol, but no one ever wrote that. John Wesley particularly didn't write ever that people should stop drinking alcohol.
Oh, really?
That wasn't part of what they said. I mean, they were certainly against people spending too much on alcohol, people being excessively drunken, not being able to support their families or their jobs and so on. Yes, they were against that, and they're really deeply involved in helping people to get out of that lifestyle. I mentioned people being excluded from membership of the societies. Often it was because they were drinking, and if they were excluded, the whole point was that they would want to come back to the meetings, and in order to get back they would have to stop drinking.
Right.
And the people in the society who were their friends and knew them could help them, and then it'd be a great matter of celebration that they'd come back into being a member of the society. They could come along again because they weren't drinking anymore. So that's where it was in the 18th century. The 19th century, I mean, similar really, but carried on another step. They decided that not just the Methodist, in fact it was a whole number of different churches of all different denominations involved in resisting abuse of alcohol by saying we weren't going to drink. And in fact really what it was about was encouraging others into that teetotal, this abstinence life. So often in the late 19th century, when people were preaching, telling people about the good news of Jesus, often people responding, the first thing they did would be stop drinking and make a commitment to stay dry, to stay teetotal. And the second thing they'd do, often in close succession, was realise the love of God for them in their lives and follow Jesus. So there was quite a number of, in the late 19th century, amazing testimonies of people saying, with the help of the new friends I've met, I've stopped drinking, and then a week later I realised how much God loved me, and I'm going to follow Jesus now in my life. So that's
kind of how we got to that point of becoming a dry faith.
Yeah, and then that carried on. I mean, it was never a necessity of Methodist membership that you shouldn't drink. It was just very common.
Right.
That people also took the pledge, which, as they say, is shorthand for pledging it to be teetotal. And I say it wasn't just Methodist; it was across a whole range of denominations. One of the only real key thing that hangs over from that, or two key things hang over from that, the Methodist Church. One is that we don't allow alcohol in Methodist Church buildings. That gets debated again and again, but often the argument that wins is that you find a lot of Methodist buildings being the host for Alcoholics Anonymous groups.
Yeah.
So people who really have a difficulty with alcoholic addiction, they need a place where they know it's going to be safe. And they're not going to encounter a party in the next room with drinks on offer. So that's a really important ministry that we have, that we don't want to disrupt by changing that rule. The other thing that you notice if you go to a Methodist church is that when we do communion, we have wine which doesn't have alcohol in it. It's still made in the same way. It's still grapes that are crushed, and as close to wine as you can get, but there's no alcohol. So that is, again, we debate that at length because it's much more normal in the Christian church across the world and across the centuries to use alcohol, because that's what Jesus used and told us to use. But again, the argument is that there are often people in most congregations who need not to drink alcohol, sometimes because of matters of addiction, sometimes because of medical reasons. So in order to include them, we keep that rule.
And I think the effect that can't be understated. I mean, even in my time at Cliff, a very close friend of mine, I won't name him, but he'd come to Cliff almost pretty much straight out of rehab for an alcohol addiction, and I remember he felt very, very at ease in a communion service at Cliff and being able to come up knowing that it wasn't real alcohol, whereas we went to a visiting church, a Church of England church or another church that used real wine, and he would have to stay sat down, and I think that was a real visible sign of actually all being welcome to the table, as it were. There's so much more of the history of Methodism I'd love to talk about, but time restricts. So one last question that I'd really love to ask you. It's a difficult one, and I don't think there is a right answer, or maybe there is, who knows. But currently in this country, Methodism is the fastest shrinking Christian denomination, which is not a wonderful thing. It's something that's being talked about a lot of conference, it's talked about a lot of the synods, that we are shrinking very quickly. What do you believe the future is of Methodism?
Well, that's a difficult question. Personally, now I can't speak on behalf of the church, personally, I see the future of Methodism as, in every different situation where it exists as a separate entity, to be working with other Christians in its locality. And in fact, that is lived out practically across the country in all sorts of situations where the Methodist Church has actually been at the heart of helping Christians of all different traditions to work together. And sometimes that has meant Methodist churches joining up with other local churches Personally, I always think that Christian witness, telling people about the good news of Jesus, is much better done together, because that's a really strong sign that the differences from the past that divided Christians, we're willing to forgive and work out together now, in order for the sake of better being able to tell other people about Jesus and to serve other people in our neighbourhoods. So I think that's where the Methodist Church's future lies. And in terms of how that might happen on a bigger scale, I mean, that, as I say, that's happened across the country in all sorts of ways, with Church of England, Baptist, United Reformed Church, Catholic Church in some instances, all sorts of different churches joining together. Nationally, we have committed ourselves since 2003 to investigate that and to journey towards that with the Church of England. So that's where Methodism is heading by its own decision. Now, there's different views within the Methodist Church about how quick or how far that should go. Personally, I'd love it to see it go quite far. I'm minister in a church which is United Methodist and Church of England. So we have a congregation of, well, it's hard to pin down exactly how many we have, but probably average about 80 or 90 on a Sunday. And we have myself and a Church of England vicar work together as a team, and I think that's the way forward.
It could be quite a poetic full circle, as to start within the Church of England as a Methodist society, and to then go back almost into that kind of form of Methodism within Church of England, or Church of England within Methodism, or this co-opted kind of future. Yeah,
and I think there's all sorts of things from our roots which this works well with. One of John Wesley's very sermons, which is a favourite of the Methodist people. In fact, there's lots of John Wesley sermons that the Methodist people now no longer read anymore, but they really quite like this one, which is called The Catholic Spirit, which is the idea that there are things which divide Christians, but that Christians are called to have a Catholic spirit and to realise that there are things at the heart of our faith that we share in common. It's the same Jesus Christ that we follow. And so my thought is that we honour that by that thought from our early roots, by seeking to find ways of working together. As I said, it's for the sake of mission and evangelism, of sharing good news, that you do it. So the church where I minister, when we have communion, we talked about communion wine, because it's Church of England and it's Methodist together, we do everything together. There's only one congregation, one church. But we do have two wines at communion, because for some Methodists it's really very important you have the non-alcoholic wine. And for some Anglicans, and in fact in the understanding of communion of the Anglican Church, it has to be alcoholic wine. So
yes, I've come across a few.
We have both. And some people get upset. They say, well, it's really difficult because it's a sign of how we're not one. We're divided at the very heart of our worship. But I say, well, actually, no, it's really powerful that at the heart of our worship is this sign that although we are still divided on some things, we can be together. And I think that's a really important message to give to the wider community, that God calls us to be one people.
I can't think of a more befitting way to end than this idea of union with Christians. And although we are different, and the history of Methodism shows our differences and our origins in that ultimately we are all followers of Christ, and ultimately we are all bound in that.
Indeed, amen.
Amen, yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today, and I'm sure people listening will get a lot out of that. And who knows, you may even get Aaron knocking at your door now after.
It's a pleasure. Aaron and I have an ongoing conversation, which you might want to join. Have a dual conversation.
I'd love to. Right, well, my mind's running on that now. Yeah, that'd be wonderful. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.